Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Embracing Differences with me, Nippin. Today I'm joined by a very close friend and a mentor. I believe he's my mentor in many ways. He's taught me a lot of things, and so proud to have him on with me on this podcast. Greg, would you do a very little or very light introduction about yourself, and then we can start off? Not that you need to, but maybe as a ritual.
As a ritual, thanks, Nippin. I think anybody who follows along on any of your podcasts probably have heard me speak before, but I'm an Australian-based lawyer. I specialise in workplace health and safety law, and I have a real interest in the whole world of safety management and its rituals and the philosophies that underpin it and how it applies in practice or doesn't work in practice, which is what I see. And it's a pleasure to chat with you again, Nippin. It's been a while since you were here at our property. Um, Last time you were here, it was quite warm, I think, and I don't know if you can hear in the background, but we've got thunder and the rain. We've got the first rain here since October last year, so everything is just dry. But thankfully now everything's freshening up. And if you hear any panicking, it's because I've got my little dog, my Jack Russell, in the room with me because she doesn't like the thunder. She's just sitting at my feet panting. But as I say, it's been a while since you've been here. You're coming back for a couple of days at the end of May, 27, 28 May. We're very lucky you're coming to run your Learning from Investigations program. This will be an opportunity for me to share this with my network a bit more broadly in Perth. So I'd really appreciate it if you could just talk us through, what the program's about, but more importantly, I guess, what are the philosophies for underpinning it? I mean, why do we need this program?
Great question, Greg, and thank you for the invite. I think, Greg, we are very good at. Well, we started off in this area by focusing on people involved in the accidents, and we have done fairly well in the last few years in that space to understand the behavior of people and the front line, if you like, for the lack of a better term.
Yeah.
We then moved into something more intense, which is looking at the work context and trying to understand how we can improve the context of the work or where the shortcomings are, and see how we can improve that. And there's been a lot of work in that space. Some call it safety differently, others call it human and organizational performance. But it's essentially trying to understand the broader organization rather than just focusing on the people. And I think what I find interesting, Greg, is that uh, earlier on it used to be the focus was the hero, if you like, the successful one or the right one was always the organization. I was the worker who was the
Mm.
bad one. And in this new way of thinking, we have somehow created the worker as the hero. And in some ways, we have pushed the attribution upwards in the organization. Um,
Yeah.
and so, what I find interesting is that when you do an investigation, whether you are processing the data or you're talking to people or you are writing a report, how can you escape from your subjectivity? And I think,
Mm.
in my view, a lot of learning opportunity lies in understanding and focusing on how investigations are actually done and by whom. What are the past experiences of these people? What are their motivations? What are their aspirations? How do they see the world?
Mm.
And I think if we don't understand that, we are so far away from producing any sort of meaningful learning. Because to me, organizations don't learn, people learn, and people move. And if we think that investigators have don't have to learn, then I think there's a serious gap here. And much of my work is actually starting with the individual who is actually involved in the process. How are these people learning. And by that, it's a very simple question, Greg, that tell me, what have you learned about yourself after
Mm.
completing that investigation, the last investigation you did? And I think that's something that drives my philosophy of investigations.
And you've captured a lot of that in your new book as well, haven't you? I mean, that was my reading of the draft that you were kind enough to send me to have a look at.
Absolutely, Greg. That was the focus of the book, and it took about it was a journey.
Yeah, it's interesting. We were chatting, before we started, the idea of learning from incidents. I mean, at one level, I really get it. I think I get it at a theoretical and intellectual level. I understand what it is, but it's fascinating when you operate, for me, in a legal paradigm where very often the purpose of doing an investigation is not to learn for the purposes of improving. It is to learn for the purposes of looking after the interests of your client, which may be very different from the interests of a lot of the people affected by the thing that is being investigated. And then what I find even more fascinating is when I find it both fascinating and hypocritical in the context of health and safety, is that the pinnacle solution, or that's probably putting it too highly, but the sort of last solution of improving health and safety at work is a prosecution. That's what we say. You say, if you're bad enough and you really need to be taught how to improve, there's this legislation and we're going to prosecute you. And the one thing you do not do in a prosecution is learn. And it's because nobody is there to share a common understanding, to reach common ground, to transparently divulge more than they have to divulge. And I remember, I think I've told this story to you before, but I remember acting for, there's a fatality event a few years ago, and the business owner ended up going to jail, and he was my client. And the magistrate in the prosecution said neither the defendant nor the prosecutor could explain why the work was performed the way it was done on the day, which, if I look at your perspective from a genuine wanting to learn from that type of horrible event, that would be one of the primary concerns. Why were things done this way? Not to say it's your fault they were done that way or anything like that, but to say genuinely what made sense to the people at the time, what was their context, why did they think it was okay to do this? None of that. And none of that comes up in a prosecution because it's not in anybody's interests to have that conversation.
No.
I find it really disappointing.
It is at one level, but you got to think really hard about this thing. That the question is that there is a difference between what we are learning and what we are realizing, and how much of it we really want to admit and share with the world. So,
Yeah.
so you see the Costa Concordia accident, for example, or many accidents. There's one person in the jail. Let's start with him. He has been in the jail for the last 7 years now, and he writes to me. He's changed as a person. He's completely changed as a person.
Yeah, of course.
And he writes, and he's so articulative about what he writes. Even when he was under house arrest and I met him, he actually produced the world's lightest canoe. He prototyped it and he produced it. And he did it for his daughter. So people are known to bring the best out of their shadow, of their dark side of personality when they're going through this kind of things. There's a lot of creativity in people when you push them to their limits. And this is one of the things where I find it so difficult to embrace the idea of positive psychology, that we want to learn from things going well, all good. But sometimes, and a lot of times, accidents are an opportunity to bring an entire organization to the fringes of dissonance, to say, you shatter their worldview completely. What have we been thinking? And that's one level, Greg. At another level,
Mm.
you talk to people within the organization, there is a realization. The trouble is that a lot of it is not admitted in the open. And it's not admitted because people don't want to be seen as bad, as vulnerable, as weak, which is, the way the society
Sure.
works. So the trouble is that there's a lot of implicit knowledge, but it never becomes explicit in many ways. And I think that's something I talk about in the penultimate chapter of the book, that you cannot escape blame and you cannot escape scapegoating. It's been around for 3,000 years, since it started off in Israel, and you just can't get rid of it. What you can do is admit that the human nature is violent. We are violent by nature, and in order to satisfy the needs of the society, when a ship collapses or capsizes,
Yeah.
somebody will be blamed. That's
Yes.
really the important thing, that stop talking about not blaming people, about that idealist world that we have created, because there will always be somebody who will be scapegoated. The idea is that how can we get smarter to put our time and resources in other places where we can make improvements, rather than s-
I was just going to ask though, Nippin, is in your view, is there at least an imperative to go into an investigative process not seeking to blame? I
um,
mean, I accept the social role that blame plays, and trust me, I'm on the other side. Yeah, when you're a lawyer, you know the social role that blame plays. That's how everything hangs together. But then surely there must be, and I suppose it depends a bit. If you are talking about a catastrophic failure in shipping or construction, dozens of people have died. Nobody is going into that exercise under the illusion that there's going to be winners and losers, right? But when we're dealing with individuals in the workplace and the events are not so catastrophic, if they're catastrophic at all, they're just near misses where they are genuine opportunities to learn. Do you think there is a value of sort of accepting people's failure, which there will inevitably be because we're fallible human beings? Somebody will fail or make an error or a mistake, but not turning that into a blameworthy, punishable error, fallibility, or mistake?
I love the first time I hear somebody using the word fallibility. Very, very rarely I see that. Um, the answer to your question, in my view, is that of course it is possible. The trouble is that we don't have a philosophy in accident investigations that actually
Mm.
embraces the imperfection of being a human being. What we have
No, I
is,
accept that. Yeah.
yeah, we have a philosophy called managing error, and we have a philosophy called denying error, that there is no such thing like error. But we do not
Yep.
have anything close to embracing fallibility. So, what's interesting is the first question you ask the person involved in an accident already tells me how you are thinking about it.
Yep.
This first question, if the first question is, tell me about the work, tell me about the work context, tell me about why did you do that or you didn't do that, already tells me your approach. But if you start off with making a connection with the person, and
Mm.
just keeping your agenda on the one side and just asking an open question, what would you like to share with me? Where would you like to begin? Walk me through the steps involved in this work. What have you learned from it? What have I learned from it? I think that's a very different way of looking at it. And
Mm.
everything else starts to make sense from that position. So to answer your question, I think, yes, there is a methodology and there is a method, but I think most of the times we fall into the trap of trying to manage or control error.
Yeah, look. I find it fascinating. having looked at this stuff for so long now, you mentioned safety differently before and some of the new view type views, and I'm not convinced at a macro level that much of what we see is genuinely new. But I think what we see is, I do believe we're seeing genuine attempts to put a different approach or different philosophical bent to the same processes. So, and what I think what you've described actually illustrates that. So, it doesn't matter what you call it. You can call it an investigation or a learning team or whatever. It doesn't matter. What you are doing is you are inquiring into work. Either something's gone wrong, something hasn't gone wrong, but you are inquiring into work. And there are probably countless ways that you can inquire into work. And when whatever personal biases or approaches you bring to that inquiry is probably going to very much dictate the outcome, I would have thought.
And this goes back to what I said earlier, that if you don't know as an investigator where you stand, what's your position, what's your bias, what's your assumptions,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
going to, doesn't matter what you investigate. Greg, I'll give you an example. I was doing an investigation a few days ago on somebody who has a certain faith, and I asked him some questions about himself. And I said, "So what have you learned from this investigation?" And his answer was, "What's there to learn? It's God's will."
Yeah.
And then he kept repeating that, "It's God's will." And he said that at least 3 or 4 times, even during the course of the interview. My point is this: you can have the best investigation systems in the world, you can have the most trained and competent people doing it. But if they are not aware of their own belief system and they're not aware of these cultural differences, how on
Yeah.
earth are you going to make any changes through processes and systems? You can push this
Yeah.
guy, beat him to the limits, and say, you need to follow this process because it comes from
Yeah.
another faith, which is find a root cause and put a corrective action. But in his world, there is no such thing. In his world, all that exists is he has no control over the situation. It's God's will. How are you going to make him learn anything at all? Tell me.
Hmm. That's interesting. Yeah. And sorry, and you do hear, or I have heard, sorry, over the years, similar sorts of observations around that sort of thing.
You you see a lot of times in the near miss reporting systems, somebody's detected a problem, let's say a leak or an unsafe behavior, and the immediate response is, "Oh, excellent job, well done." You
Mm,
commend you make a hero out of this person. But that's the
yeah.
Greek myth at play. That's the heroes and the
Yeah.
anti-heroes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then you have the quick response to say, "Why did you not follow the process?" Which is the Christian myth
Yeah.
at play, which is, so you don't understand that you're actually working with belief systems underneath. And if you are not aware of your own assumptions and biases as an investigator, you're not getting very far with whatever you want to learn.
No.
This, in terms of facts, evidences, you can put a lot of stuff there. There's in this 175-page report on the Costa Concordia, there is no dearth of evidences and facts. But in the end, it's an anti-hero narrative. That's what it is. And people don't get it,
Mm,
that this industry is more religious than it thinks it is. And quite often what you see is people say, "I'm not religious." Well, of course you are. Some people worship money and that's their religion. So
yeah.
we cannot run away from what we believe in, and to me that's the starting point, Greg.
I think most people listening to this, myself included, would find that level of introspection and willingness to accept the history that sits behind each of us as individuals and how much influence it has quite uncomfortable and quite disarming to bring that perspective to an investigation. But I just want to pick up on something you said before, because I've observed this and I'm interested in your thoughts. Because it's interesting. So even if we adopt your approach, so you had the God's will roadblock, and what you described as a sort of the Christian background of just follow the process. And it's interesting because both of those positions to me are very convenient points for organisations to stop looking. So if somebody says, "Oh, it's God's will," so well, there's nothing wrong with our systems. Our approaches are all fine. It's this person's belief or value set, so we don't need to inquire any further into what we're doing, which is just another way of describing what we do when we say, "Oh, they've breached the policy and procedure. We don't need to look any further. If they would just follow the process, they'd be okay." So they become very convenient stepping off points, don't they? To say, well, it's obvious what's going on here. We don't need to dig any further. I mean, and even I think even, and this might not be the right language, I'll be guided by you, but the idea that we use a belief that somebody else is unable to learn or change as a really convenient point to say, therefore we don't need to learn or change.
Absolutely, Greg. And Greg, I actually did some word mapping yesterday, and I will show this to you. It's fascinating.
Well, the whiteboard out.
Yeah, maybe not, because it doesn't cover the whole thing. But let me just talk to you about it.
Yeah, talk us through.
If you look at the Christian myth, for example, it's all about compliance and rule following. There's one God. He created the world in 7 days, and on the seventh day, he gave it to the human beings, and he told them not to eat that apple from the tree, and they did. So they are doomed. And that's the original sin. That's the human error. That's we are after. That's when we say follow the process. And this is the God with the capital G, right? One God, one rule, follow the rule. That's the safety management system, right? And then you have another Abrahamic faith, which says that, no, whatever happens, don't question it. It's God's will. And that's what comes out from it, right? And then you go to the Greek myth, and it says that it's not about compliance. It's actually about defiance, which is Sully at work. That there is an unjust world, and we need more justice in this world. There is a lot of chaos in this world, and we need to create order out of chaos. And those who create or can create order out of chaos become the heroes, and hence Sully. He flies the plane, the bird strike, engine failure, and whatever happened, and we commend this hero. We create a hero out of it. That's the Greek myth at play. And then comes the Indian myth or the Hindu myth, which is, it's not about compliance, it's not about defiance. Learning is all about self-realization. It's the journey of life is all about learning more about yourself. It's connecting with yourself. And Greg, it's interesting that you asked me, what did you learn from this 6-7 years? What I learned was that how religious I am deep inside, even though I never believed that I was a religious person. And the point is, you cannot run away from your belief. You just can't. It's there. And in the second chapter of the book, you read it, I actually show to the investigators how religious they are, even though they think that they are doing a scientific objective exercise. We are so belief-driven, Craig. We are not even aware of that. And the interesting thing is that when we do this workshop, when we spend a couple of days with people, start to help them meditate and reflect on their language, everything floats up, everything. And people are mostly left shocked after that.
Yeah, I find the work that you do, I mean, this whole social psychology of risk approach is very it's powerful and it's helpful, and it has a role to play. And I think it's interesting because everything that I see, and I'm talking from an Australian context, so much of the philosophy and approach and the ideas and the thinking that I think could help us to create better workplaces for people, from my perspective, and again, I bring 30 years of legal bias to this, are often stymied because of the legal framework within which they operate. And it seems to me that, in the same way that belief systems, the pendulum can swing too far. I mean, you take a belief system around any of the major faiths, and you get extremisms at all levels of it. But I see that at the moment in the legal framework, at least in Australia, we've got this extreme system of retributive justice, which I think really hampers genuine inquiry into understanding workplace safety, understanding work, how work is performed, why work fails, the fallibility of people. I mean, God forbid that we would, ever call someone like yourself as an expert witness in a court case to explain all these underlying philosophies, because no one in the courtroom is interested in that. It's a very linear, factual process, and so trying to blend these ideas together is an enormous challenge. But again, to learn from my own comments before, just because we bump up against something that seems immovable, be it breaching procedures or faith in God, that ought not stop us from continuing to challenge and learn and question what's in front of us.
Yes, and you're so right, Greg, because in the end, it all comes back to realizing that my world is so limited. What I know is so
Yes.
limited. I'm constrained, and in a way, I'm a victim of my own experiences and values. So why not take this time and opportunity to listen to what other people have to say? And so creating different stories and comparing between them, and some good things come out from there. Some really nice things, some really powerful things come
Yeah.
out from there.
Yeah. I think
And it's
you talk to me, and I apologise if I misattribute this, but the idea of sort of changing workplaces one conversation at a time. And it may be that many of the macro structures that inhibit ideally what we'd like to see are not going to change. But I think you're right. I think there are daily opportunities for learning and sharing and just gaining more insight.
when I read your work on risky conversations with Rob and Craig, it was such a
Craig, yeah.
powerful exercise trying to understand the power of risky conversations, as you say, because there is nothing more powerful than having a conversation with people. And part of it is helping them realize where they are stuck, but part of it is realizing on your own where you are stuck. And
Yeah, absolutely.
if
Yeah.
if you want to understand how a procedure works in practice, why wouldn't you have that open conversation? Because quite often behind what we call work as done, there are belief systems at work. There are people who have been
Yep.
doing it for 20, 30 years, and they genuinely believe without even knowing that they're doing
Oh, yeah.
certain things.
And
We all
look,
take our baggage when we get to work.
and I think, my lived experience of that, Nippin, would be a decade ago, I couldn't imagine myself having this type of conversation. I was adamant that I understood the legal process and how that worked and what we needed to do to manage accidents. I'm absolutely convinced about that. But the last decade of actually immersing myself in some of the research and some of the different ways of thinking and taking a deeper look at human psychology, as much as anything else, really demonstrates how much more complex not even complex, that's not the right word, how much more wicked the problem is than a purely legalistic perspective would have you believe.
I was fascinated to hear when you said in your book, in your recent book, that take any sort of safety initiative as a research project. That's precisely where it should start. You should keep an open mind. You should keep a really open mind as to what might come next. And we don't see much of that, Greg. It's a lot of it is preconceived ideas and assumptions, and they become part of everything.
Can't wait to get you over here on the 27th and 28th, and just looking forward to sharing ideas with you again, perhaps catching up for another meal. My turn to cook this time, and really getting a chance for you to share the wisdom with people over here in WA. Looking forward to it.
Wonderful, Greg. Wonderful. And so nice to talk to you as always. And yes, looking forward to seeing you. Have a lovely evening. Yes.
You too, Nippin. Take care.
Bye.